Hello, Pittsburgh. I'm Zac Gibson, and this is TribLive's From the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. Pine-Richland School District's school board has become the latest local system to join the conversation of library censorship and book bans, thanks to a new policy brought on by a narrow vote that has engaged board and community members alike. As the board nears primary election season, James Engel is here to give us the details of this new policy and the impact it could have. Hi, James. Thanks for coming on.
Glad to be here.
All right. As always, let's get straight into it. So we're going to talk about this new policy that has a sort of transfer of power going on. It seems to be a pretty big deal for those involved in the PR school district, but for those of us who are less familiar, can you tell me what this policy is all about?
Yeah, to be clear, so far, no books have actually been banned at Pine-Richland. This is only a sort of policy update, a big one, but it sets up what could potentially be a book ban. But as of now, no books have been taken off the shelves or removed from the library or anything like that. What the policy does more or less is a transfer of power. It takes what previously was the superintendent of the district's power to say which books ultimately could stay or go in the library, and it puts it in the hands of the board, in addition to all new books that might be placed in the library.
What can you tell me about, was there a previous system that was the reason for this to come up, or was there some sort of problem that needed to be addressed?
So, yeah, there was a previous policy, and it included a way for parents to challenge a book or to write into the library so that their specific child was not allowed access to certain books if they preferred. In 2023, a group of residents challenged a little more than a dozen books in the district, and following that, the superintendent formed a committee of various stakeholders who recommended that all of the books except one, which was a split vote, should stay in the library. That power, which, like I said, at the time rested with the superintendent, he said that they should all stay in the library. But following that, the board began working on this new policy that places that power in their hands, which they passed earlier this week. Most of the board members agreed that the previous policy needed some updates. It was a little hazy on where the sort of line of power was, but the minority members who were outvoted earlier this week generally wanted to see a sort of soft update to the previous policy, whereas this policy is more or less a new one wholesale.
Okay. In your story, you detail some of the issues that are taken with this policy by community members and some board members. So can you tell me about what is making this policy so contentious?
Yeah, a lot of community members that have come out to meetings repeatedly have labeled it a book ban, even if that is not entirely accurate. It's, I think, in their view, essentially the setup to a book ban, or what could potentially be one. So mainly, people have taken issue with the definition of terms. So the new policy outlaws books that include pervasive vulgarity and explicit sexual content. There are definitions of those terms in the policy, but I think that, as most would agree, those can be personally defined. And so different community members and members of the board have sort of gone back and forth about what exactly those terms are and how that should be applied to the policy. There's exceptions in the policy for, I think it's classical art or classical literature or something like that, so that older books that might be expected for kids to read that may include pervasive vulgarity or explicit sexual content can be included, and that was also a contentious point. In addition to that, there's a 30-day waiting period, and that was especially controversial even in the latest meeting. So when a new set of library books that would be included in school libraries is delivered, it now would have to go through a 30-day waiting period where residents or parents or whomever in the community could file objections to those books so that they are never included at all. And various minority members of the board tried to make amendments to make that period shorter, something like 7 days, or eliminate it altogether, but ultimately they were all unsuccessful, and it is 30 days.
Okay. Now, before we started recording, we talked a little bit about the national conversation surrounding book bans. And there have been various censorship and book banning incidents of late nationally that seem to point towards a societal shift in sentiment for many when it comes to coexisting beliefs and different lifestyles within the education environment. So how do we see this really being enacted here in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I mean, I think Pine-Richland is a sort of local manifestation of that conversation. A lot of the sort of terms that you're hearing on the national level, like parental rights, are brought up here. And that is generally what supporters of the policy have supported, is the idea of parental rights, and that this places greater control in the hands of parents rather than, I guess, at the expense perhaps of teachers or librarians or whomever. But I mean, I'll point out that many opponents of the policy have also said that this is very similar to another incident that occurred in Pennsylvania a couple years ago in Central Bucks School District. That's out by Philly. And there they implemented a policy that is quite similar to this one in some ways, word for word. And some books were taken off the shelves, others were challenged en masse. But ultimately, the board that implemented that policy was voted out in the next election, and the policy was reversed.
Let's talk about the actual meetings and experience that led to this new policy. You were in the meetings when the policy were discussed and when it was passed. What was it like to be in the meetings leading up to this latest on Monday? As a reporter, what was your plan while collecting subject interviews?
The meetings were long. That's the first thing I'd say. One of the reads of this policy, which went through a sort of process called seriatim, that meeting was 7 hours long. I was not present, but I had to sift through the better part of that recording, and the meeting following that was 5 hours. So these meetings have been extensive. Every meeting I have been to, the public comment period, which is 1 hour, 3 minutes per speaker, has been full without question at the beginning. This most recent meeting was especially contentious, I would say, because more supporters of the policy appeared. Previously, I mean, some of them had called in to the meeting, which you can do, but I hadn't really seen them until this most recent meeting where they did make up a large body of the audience. And that the meetings are sometimes a little rowdy, often pretty rowdy. You get people yelling at the crowd, yelling from the crowd at the board, making comments, people bickering amongst themselves in the audience. It's not a standard boring school board meeting.
Throughout this episode, our listeners will hear some of the sound bites from these meetings and some specific conversations or statements that we got to hear were from Eli Santiago, who really credited the board's collaboration in support of the policy, and he akined the policy to movie ratings rather than a book ban. Can you tell me a little bit about Eli's speech?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Santiago that is the first time I had seen him in person, but I've heard he calls in frequently to meetings to express his support for the board majority. Yeah, I think his quote was a judicious exercise of judgment rather than a book ban. And I mean, at a certain point, I do think it's just a sort of fundamental difference of understanding of how a library should operate.
Let's get real. We have to differ. We have to have those situations. Now, the vitriol apparently in these last several months, perhaps a year, seems to center around the issue of sexually related materials. And the library policy apparently is addressing that. Now, I remember a number of years ago, if you went to the movies, there were ratings. There were either G for general, PG for parental guidance, R, X, and so forth and so forth. Why were they there? To protect minors from being exposed to material that was considered inappropriate. Somehow we seem to think that because the school wants to implement similar policies, that is a way of that is a tantamount to book banning. With all the books that we have in here, a small fraction of the books that appear to be on that edge, where maybe I wouldn't want my child to be exposed to, that is not book banning. That's judicious exercise of judgment. And so I just think we have to...
I think from Mr. Santiago's point of view, if a book is inappropriate for a high schooler or a middle schooler or whomever, it should not be in a library, full stop. And then there's others, like, I mean, Elise Duckworth has been a pretty prominent voice, student voice in opposition to the board majority. And people like her, I think, would point to say that this would target especially minority communities like LGBTQ folks and that it would have an uneven application.
As a student, I can share that I know these people that are going to be targeted by this policy. I spend countless hours engaging with all of these people who I've grown to love and that would never go out of their way to put a student in an uncomfortable position. I also know the students who don't feel a voice in the school or that they don't belong. I know the book lovers who have dedicated their lives to reading, expanding their minds, and understanding the world to the best of their abilities. I know the teachers that check in on me on my low moments and help me thrive in my higher ones. I know the librarians who truly have the most beautiful passion for reading. And I also know the community members who just want their kids to read freely. I ask you to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Each person I've mentioned here tonight is relying on you to make a decision that respects everyone it affects. It may feel as though you were stuck in the side that you were on, but everyone has a choice tonight to choose for themselves. So I urge you to ask yourself, who are you truly serving?
Elise Duckworth created a petition against the board's actions before they passed this policy. If you find the book inappropriate, a parent does have the right to call in and not let their kid read it, and don't read it. I think that's a general point of opposition people. It should still stay in the library, even if some people don't want to read it or take offense to it. It doesn't mean it should leave the library entirely.
Throughout these meetings, you've interviewed many different people. You've gotten to hear both sides of the story from various points. And in the end, on Monday, the board voted in a contentious and narrow vote to approve this policy in a vote 5-4. Can you tell me a little bit about the meeting where the policy was approved and who ended up making these final decisions?
So battle lines have been drawn more or less for a little while now. The 5-person board majority, and that is Christina Brisalis, Mike Weethorn, Lisa Hillman, Leslie Miller, Philip Morissette. Those 5 have voted in a block in general pretty consistently. The 4 dissenters of the board who did not agree with this policy, they don't necessarily agree ideologically on everything, but they certainly have voiced that they do not agree with this new policy. The meeting, like the other meetings, was pretty raucous. This time there was a fair amount of supporters in the crowd. And so right before the vote happened, which for as dramatic as I think many people thought it was, it just looked like a regular school board vote, 5 yeas, 4 nays. Right before that, Ashley Fortier, who's been a pretty prominent opposition voice, gave a pretty extensive speech outlining the disagreements that she has had with the board majority throughout the process, and saying that she felt that the whole thing was disrespectful to teachers and librarians for, I guess from her opinion, expressing mistrust by giving the power to the board rather than allowing them to do their jobs more or less.
I want to be clear about my stance, reflect on this process, and share my experience over the past 7 months. First, I come to these meetings prepared and ready for meaningful discussion. Yet time and again, the process has felt like a setup. Votes appear predetermined among the voting block of 5, with little interest in learning, collaboration, or genuine curiosity and compromise. Yet, I cannot identify a single substantial area where middle ground has been reached. Principals, administrators, librarians, and even the solicitor have suggested changes, and yet those recommendations have been largely ignored. I stand with our students, families, educators, and our greater community who deserve better.
After that speech, those who were there in opposition gave a resounding applause and stood and clapped, but 2 minutes later, once they passed it, the other side stood up and gave applause. After the meeting, some of those people stuck around to shake the hands of the board majority and talk. But I mean, in the meantime, there was definitely some turmoil in the crowd. There was some muttered and sometimes not so muttered debate amongst people there. And although this isn't unique for one of these board meetings, there was people yelling from the audience at the board trying to tell them to stay orderly, and a sort of back and forth that's become familiar there.
The policy went into effect immediately. So throughout all of these meetings, you got to hear from and throughout your story speak to at different points John Foligno. What overall did he have to say regarding this policy and this process?
Yeah, I mean, John is a Pine-Richland senior. At the meeting, he spoke twice, and he said that he agreed with the concept of parental rights, which has been a sort of hallmark of the majority's stance. But he questioned how the policy might be applied and whether it might affect especially LGBTQ people, and said that the sort of whole pretext of changing it, those parents back in 23, he said it was flimsy. And I don't think he's unique in that view.
You've already told us about board member opinions. You told us about Ashley Fortier's statement, and we got to hear that. We also hear in your story that board president Philip Morissette is proud and content with the long, hard process coming to fruition, as well as another member, Brusalis, saying she was happy to see it passed. What strikes me as interesting, though, is Mark Kashani. He's another board member, and he had something interesting to say as he was giving his vote. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Kashani, he's consistently voted against this policy, but I think he would describe himself as a conservative. He told me after the meeting, yeah, he wanted the final say on books to be in the hands of the board. That's something he sought, but he said he sought that through minor adjustments and just more or less clarifications to the previous policy rather than this new wholesale policy. He said that the policy went too far, essentially, and that he didn't appreciate the definitions and essentially the extensive board involvement that will likely involve.
Okay. Now, I thought that was interesting because the potential that is seen both from the community and within the board itself for misuse of this policy. Now, already, this policy has been contentious in its creation and passing, but before it's even gotten to be used in any format, it seems like there will be challenges ahead. Can you tell me about attorney and Pine-Richland parent, Chris Caffardi?
I will say I don't think it will be challenged before it is implemented. I do think that many are on edge to see exactly how it will be implemented. And if it is implemented in a way that they view as uneven, like Mr. Caffardi, then they will go ahead and challenge it. Mr. Caffardi told me he intends to donate around a dozen books to the district, and he expects that the board majority would unevenly apply their policy against certain groups of people like LGBTQ folks. That might be the basis for a lawsuit, an equal protection lawsuit.
Now, in your story, it says, in the case of a legal battle, Caffardi said he expects the Pennsylvania branch of the ACLU to get involved.
And I should say that Mr. Caffardi's wife, Amy Caffardi, is running for school board. So while I do think that he is a firm believer in what he's doing, he's also not exactly a neutral player in this as well. From what he's told me, yes. I mean, he said that he's been in contact with the ACLU and that among other groups, he expects that if this does end up in court somehow, that they would become involved.
Okay. As you just hinted at, all of this is coming as of the time of the release of this episode, 2 months exactly of the board's primary elections. In these elections, there are 4 potential seats.
Yeah, so I mean, these are just the primaries, so nobody's actually going to lose a seat. At worst, they would become lame ducks. So the 4 seats are Amy Turchik, Christina Brisalis, Joe Cassidy, and Lisa Hillman's seats. Ms. Hillman is not running again, so that seat will be filled with somebody new. Mrs. Turchik and Mrs. Brisalis, they differ. Mrs. Turchik has been firmly against this policy, while Mrs. Brisalis has been one of its strongest opponents. And Mr. Cassidy, while normally quiet during meetings, also has been an opponent of the policy. So there is essentially 2 from each side that are up from election. From the petitions that have been filed, it looks like it's going to be a contentious one. There's several people running in each of the 3 regions of the district. And come the general election in November, it has the potential to really shake things up. And if the current majority loses, then the new policy is liable to be repealed.
Okay, well, you're leading right into my last question. So I'll ask, how do you think this recent policy shakeup could determine the outcomes of the election? And to go a step further, how do you think the results of that election could affect the policy in turn?
I'd say at this point, people are certainly paying attention. The school board is a down ballot thing that people are normally not super keyed into. And in my reporting, I've never seen a place that is so tuned into its school board as Pine-Richland. So I'd say that the election is certainly going to get a lot of attention. Whether opponents of the policy can break the majority, that remains to be seen. But I think that they're certainly going to run candidates in that effort while the majority runs to retain its seats. So I can't predict what this election will yield, but I would say that if the current board minority would become a majority, they would almost certainly repeal the policy, as was the case in Central Bucks School District out by Philadelphia, which after they implemented their controversial policy, there was an election that swept aside that majority and brought in a new one, which did end up repealing it.
Okay. Well, James, thanks again for joining me today to come in and discuss this topic and help provide some insight on these local updates.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zac Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.